Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to today's cross-state convening, virtual convening, I should say, on reviewing and streamlining state regulations and portals for business. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm Rachel Stevens. I'm the director of the Workforce Development and Economic Policy Program at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. I'm looking forward to today's session. We're going to be digging into a couple of topics that we have not done as much content on as some of our partner organizations over the last couple of years, and we've really been working to delve into these subjects with our members and their advisors further. Specifically, we're going to be talking about two very important topics for governors and their economic policy leads, looking to create business-friendly environments in their states. These two topics will also be featured in detail in upcoming publications from NGA and Pew that you will learn more about today as we go through today's webinar. Today, we're really pleased to be joined by our partners and supporters and friends at the Pew Charitable Trusts. So special thank you to the Pew team who's with us today, again, for your support as well as your partnership and bringing all of your expertise and insights into our work around streamlining and improving business regulatory processes for states. Before we jump ahead to the agenda, I'm just going to ask you all to please go ahead and enter your names and what state you're joining from in our Q&A box so we can all see where everyone is joining from as we go through the day today. If you can go to the next slide, please. Just to quickly give an overview of the day's agenda, we will first give you a quick introduction. I'll talk a little bit about NGA and who we are, and my colleague Sharon Pearson at Pew will talk about Pew's work in this space and our partnership on this project. We'll then dive right into our first of two panels. Our first panel will be focused on state one-stop portals for business, be moderated by our partners at Pew, and will feature 4 state and national experts who are going to discuss how states are leveraging technology to streamline processes for new and existing businesses, as well as state agencies. We'll then take a quick break, let everyone move around a little bit, then move to our second panel for the day, moderated by our NGA project team, which we'll introduce here in a few minutes. And again, featuring 4 state and national experts, this time talking about state approaches to reviewing business regulations across agencies to reduce the burden on businesses and state agencies while maintaining oversight and compliance. We'll have time for Q&A following each panel, as well as time for our final questions and discussions at the end of the day before we wrap up. You can submit questions to us using the Q&A function on your screen. That's the best way to get questions to our moderators. And please do also feel free to, again, remember to introduce yourselves in the Q&A function here as we get started. As a note, this session is being recorded. We will be providing the recording and slides posted to the NGA website shortly following today's event. We'll make sure that information is available to all of you. But we will not necessarily post the entire Q&A portion depending on how those discussions go. So please do consider that Q&A time an opportunity for really open dialogue with our speakers, and with your peers who are also joining this conversation. And again, we can cut out those conversations if there's anything we don't want to share publicly on our website. All right, so if we're good to go with all that, I'll quickly talk about NGA. The National Governors Association is the nation's only bipartisan membership organization representing the nation's governors of our 55 states and territories. Through NGA, governors have an opportunity that's really unparalleled in any other forum. And that opportunity is to work together to identify priority issues and address matters of public policy at the state, national, and even global levels, as well as engage in direct exchange with each other about the challenges they're facing and the accomplishments that they're realizing. The NGA Center for Best Practices is where my team sits, and we are the only research and consulting firm that is dedicated to directly supporting governors and executive branch leaders that they appoint, as well as their advisors. And we work with them on a range of policy challenges that I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. Our government relations team is a parallel team to the NGA Center for Best Practices, and we work closely with them to ensure that what we're learning through our work with states is then reflected in the joint bipartisan priorities that governors are communicating up to our colleagues in the administration and on the Hill. We also do provide management consultative services to both new and incumbent governors, as well as their senior staff and most trusted advisors through our membership program. So really kind of providing a range of comprehensive support and services to governors to really help them maximize their impact in their time in office. I'll talk a little bit more about my team and kind of what brought us to this webinar here next. So on the next slide here, you'll see the policy program areas of the NGA Center for Best Practices listed out. My team, as I mentioned earlier, is the Workforce Development and Economic Policy team, last but certainly not least on this list. And as you might imagine, we have an opportunity to work with states on a huge range of issues that are of top priority for governors. We do a lot of our work in a few different ways. We, of course, produce research and published reports, which you may be familiar with. We also provide a lot of different kinds of customized technical assistance, as well as facilitating multi-state learning opportunities and peer learning opportunities, both in the form of long-term projects, as well as in the form of in-person or virtual events like the one that you're joining us for today. And if I could just speak a moment kind of, about the importance of the subjects we're talking about today. We've had, as an organization, a multi-year partnership and relationship with Pew, and specifically with the team supporting this project around the topic of business regulations, regulatory processes, and how states can really create a truly business-friendly environment that really fosters economic dynamism and growth in their states. We know that this has long been a bipartisan priority for governors. It's a constant priority. And a really interesting field of study for us, and one that we embarked on in what was originally going to be a 2-year project with Pew at the end of 2019. Of course, we all know that 2020 was a year that none of us planned for, and so a lot changed. But the subject of kind of how businesses are regulated, what states can do to make processes around regulatory compliance easier, more clearly communicated, easier to understand, easier to navigate, as well as kind of what the substance of some of those regulations could be, was certainly at the forefront of conversation as we were navigating a completely new normal, so to speak. And even as we look at emerging past the pandemic and recovery, and as states continue to build out long-term economic development strategies, understanding how they can leverage technology, tools, resources, different capabilities to improve how they're doing, managing some of these processes, presents a really important opportunity for states to continue to help support and spur businesses and new business growth in their states. So we are really thrilled to be joined by our partners in this project, the real experts that we teamed up with at Pew. So with that, I am very honored to hand it over to my colleague, Sharon Pearson, who's a Senior Manager of Fiscal and Economic Policy and State Fiscal Health at the Pew Charitable Trusts, to say a few words about our partnership.
Thank you so much, Rachel. As she mentioned, my name is Sharon Pearson. I'm the Senior Manager of Fiscal and Economic Policy for Pew's State Fiscal Health team. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Pew's work, we are a public charity that does research and technical assistance on everything from pensions to prisons to penguins. And in my team's case, we work on economic development policy. If you don't know our team already from our regulations work, you might know us from our work on economic development tax incentive evaluation. We started our work on business regulation process improvement with the 2018 release of our report, State Strategies to Help Businesses Launch and Expand. If you can, thank you. As our research illustrates, improvements in how regulatory agencies interact with businesses can make launching a company or bringing an innovative product to market quicker and easier. And by administering regulations more effectively and partnering with the private sector, states can lower compliance costs for businesses while still achieving important goals such as protecting the environment and public health. The NGA and Policy Academy was designed to help states apply these concepts. All participating states submitted a competitive RFP and were chosen to participate in the Policy Academy based on their thoughtful projects. Like Rachel mentioned, our focus for the Policy Academy shifted dramatically after the pandemic swiftly and drastically changed state priorities. States weren't as focused on their original proposals, for very good reasons, but the need for streamlining regulatory processes remained. What you'll hear today are some of the ways that states have used technology to help streamline regulatory processes with one-stop portals, and how states have cataloged their regulations and used these inventories to make smart decisions about how regulations are administered. So I think that is it for introductions. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, if you haven't already, enter your name and where you're from in the Q&A so that we have a record of your attendance. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Shane Benz, to discuss the panel on one-stop portals.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today. My name is Shane Benz, and I am a researcher for the Pew Charitable Trusts State Fiscal Health Project. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our first session on state one-stop portals. So as the nation adjusts to working in the COVID-19 era, many state and local governments are exploring strategies to improve how they engage with businesses from a regulatory standpoint. When government offices closed to the public in early 2020, certain longstanding regulatory compliance procedures, such as submitting paper applications for licenses through the mail or through in person, or conducting in-person inspections or site surveys, became challenging, if not impossible. Fortunately, many state offices, such as the ones you'll hear from today, took advantage of this challenge by updating how they handle business compliance. By moving many of these processes online, governments took important steps to improving the efficiency and simplicity of regulatory systems so that businesses can comply with existing rules in a less costly and less time-consuming manner. And so today, I have the true pleasure to now turn this over to several highly experienced and innovative policy experts who have pioneered the regulatory innovation movement that is improving how government interacts with businesses. First, we'll have Liz Tanner, the director of the Rhode Island Department of Business Regulation, Wisty Pender, who is the state director of Business Enterprise Resource Office within the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, E.J. Kolafarsky, who is a project manager and lead with the New Jersey Office of Innovation. And finally, but last but not least, Ellen Harple, who is the founder of Smart Incentives, a consulting firm that serves state and local governments by helping economic development organizations make sound decisions throughout the incentives process. Ellen will be releasing a paper on state one-stop online hubs in the coming month. And so once our panelists conclude with their remarks, we will dedicate the remaining portion of our session to question and answer. During their remarks and during the question and answer period, please feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A box during the presentation, including to whom you would like your question addressed. We will be sure to get through as many questions as time allows. So thank you so much for your time today, and I will now turn things over to Liz.
Thank you very much, Shane, and thank you to the NGA and the Pew teams. We've really enjoyed working with you the last few years, and I always appreciate any opportunity to show off the good work that we've done. So we don't get bonuses, right? So we get a chance to show off our work. So much appreciated. So in Rhode Island, we created a one-stop portal for how to open up a restaurant. And so that's what I'm presenting to you today. While we've done lots of great things, I can only limit it to one thing. And so that's what we're talking about here. But I've been asked to kind of explain how it came to be and how we did it and, explain the whole thing. So I'll start with saying a little bit about my background. So I'm an attorney and I've opened up several hundred businesses for my clients. And I was very familiar with the frustrations of opening up businesses in the state. And when then Governor Gina Raimondo, now Commerce Secretary Raimondo, was campaigning, she talked often about having a concierge level service for businesses to set up. So I was very much brought in to solve the problems that I had experienced with my attorneys, as an attorney with my clients. And so we started taking a look at all the one-off problems that you would hear about that just was really very much focused on processes. A lot of people like to think it's the laws and regulations that are a burden. And I can tell you right now, at least in the state of Rhode Island, it's almost always a bad process, which is a lot more fixable. It's a little harder sometimes because people just don't want to take the time to do the work. But what we've done was to try to create something better here. And so we spent a lot of time saying, okay, well, we fix these one-off situations, but how do we make these whole processes better? And so what we really started to focus on is how often does a business interact with government? And first and foremost, it was the opening of the business, followed by the building of the business. But in Rhode Island, we have a lot of restaurants that open and close every year. And so, Rhode Island's a small state. We only have 1 million people, but we have 1,000 restaurants that open every year and 1,000 restaurants that close every year. It's pretty much, that's what our number is. And we had started hearing about a lot of restaurants who were trying to open, but having some kind of a problem. And so they found themselves really far down the road and then realized they couldn't open. So for example, we had a coffee shop in one location who was just about ready to start to do major build when they found out that the water was not going to be able to be used because it was contaminated in some way. We had another one that had a gas problem, and so they weren't going to be able to use the land to have people sitting outside, which is what their main intention was. So we wanted to create a way so that people knew what they were getting into, because rarely does a restaurant owner have great business skills and a business skill know how to, someone who's an entrepreneur know how to cook, right? So we recognized that we needed to put all this information out there so that when you had the good cook who wanted to open up a restaurant, they had all the information that they needed. And when you had the good entrepreneur who needed to understand what the Department of Health guidelines were, that they had all the information. So we wanted to put it all in there. And interestingly enough, we thought it would be far more focused on the paperwork, but we realized that so much more going into opening up a business is just informing yourself and being informed up front so that you know what you're getting yourself into. So we spent a lot of time creating, we call this like a chutes and ladders chart. For those of you who remember chutes and ladders, that's what we call this form here. So how did we do it? So we had the effort led by our small business ombudsperson. And she started to try to do this work herself, because we said to her, can you please give us a list of how to open up a restaurant? And we realized that that was impossible. You can't just create a list of things to do to open up a restaurant. It was an impossible task. And we realized it was a much bigger issue than we thought it was. So we started to organize teams of people that needed to be a part of it. And when you open up a restaurant, you think you need to focus on the chef. You don't have to think about a chef for a long, long, long time, because you really need to talk about planning and zoning. You need to talk about building and permitting. You need to talk about the Department of Health. You know, I don't know about your state, but there's always a big question where the sinks can go. There's a lot of rules about where sinks can go, the things I've learned in this thing. There's also a lot of questions about the water that's coming in and the water that's going out. What are you going to do with the water that's going out? And what kind of water do you have coming in? And is it safe for the cooking that you're doing? So we also had folks involved who were in the restaurant industry so that they could explain to us what their experiences were, because they were sort of seasoned veterans. Part of it is just opening up the business. And so you need those regular folks involved. So for us, that's the Secretary of State's office, the Division of Taxation. We had some CPAs, we had some lawyers. We also had solicitors from the towns, because they were very much the ones who were handling some of those planning, zoning, and permitting issues. And we needed all levels of government. And so Rhode Island's one of the few states where we don't have county government, we have municipal government. So instead of having counties, which is the logical thing to do in a small state, instead we have 39 municipalities. So it's like we have 39 little governments. And each municipality was doing everything differently themselves, right? So we said, all right, we got to come up with a streamlined process. So we had municipal planners, we had the building officials, we had the zoning folks, we had everybody that we could think of on the municipal level. Same thing with all the state folks. We had water, historical, cemetery. Sometimes you have to worry about that. And thank goodness some of these properties are not located near schools or churches, right? Because if you do that, then it brings in another whole thing. And we also started to look at food trucks too, but that was another whole project. So it took us about 6 months. It was about most of 2 to 3 days a week. It was led by a lean consultant. So if you're not familiar with lean is the streamlining of a process. And it allowed us to address certain problems that would arise, such as a requirement for a wet signature, right? So in that case, we would either change the regulation or we would change the law, or a request for a notary. You know, we recognize that those kinds of minor requirements that people don't care so much about anymore were dragging it down. For example, one of the things we realized in the water space was the form that you sent in as a restaurateur to say, I want to get my well approved. The person who received that form would immediately take the form, rip the 2 pages off the back of it and throw it into the garbage, and immediately email the person and say, I need this information. And so we said, hey, why don't you change the form, right? Like I can see all these faces right now going, oh my gosh, why didn't we just change the form? Well, because she didn't think she was allowed to. And so we said, well, who's in charge of the form and who's in charge of your department? And she says, well, I am. And we said, well, how long have you been here? She says 6 years. So we went to her manager and said, she's in charge of this department. She doesn't need these last 2 pages. She needs this additional information. Can we change the form? We changed the form. It saved 2 weeks for water processing of wells right then and there, right? So it was just a matter of really taking this deep dive to understand every single process that you needed to do. So some of the things that we recognize were different kinds of legislation that needed to be passed. So for example, we also in the state of Rhode Island, apparently back in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a real push for slushies. Do you remember slushies? So slushies were becoming popular, and they had always been used they were being used with the same tools that soft serve ice cream was being used for. And soft serve ice cream comes through a copper tubing. And then there was so that was fine, but with a slushie, it was acidic. And so what was happening was kids were getting sick from having slushies going through copper tubing, and they were getting sick. So we created a license in Rhode Island back in the early 70s that said, if you're going to use that kind of copper tubing, you need to inform us so that we could make sure that you didn't use it for slushies because people were getting sick. So made sense. It was a small fee, but we wanted to know that. Well, here, all these years later, they forgot about the invention of plastic. We were still charging for this fee. And so every restaurant who had any kind of a soft serve ice cream or like a margarita mix at their bar or something like that, they were having to pay this extra fee. So we passed legislation to just get rid of the fee. I mean, it was only making the state something like $80,000 a year for the processing of all of it. So we got rid of that. So those are some of the things that you have to do. But what did we really need to make it happen is you got to have support from the top, straight from the governor down to the Commerce Secretary to my team and myself. That was the only way it was going to happen, because we needed all of those people in a room. And to get them in a room, we needed to push and prod to have everybody in the room. We needed to get dollars for the website. We should have done it earlier. We didn't ask for those dollars until it was delayed. And then our new governor came in. So we had Governor McKee came in, and once he did, then we were able to approve those dollars. But there was a transition because of a change of the governors and a change of leadership. So that delayed us. The feedback we've received so far is phenomenal. We launched it just under a year ago now. It's been well received by the industry. So our Rhode Island Hospitality Association, they will refer people to this website. Again, small state, we've already had over 10,000 users use this system. And so if you think about it, if you only got 1,000 restaurants opening and closing per year, and we've already had 10,000 users using it, that's a pretty good ratio. So we're very pleased with that. And it's just been used frequently as a form of, this is where we should be going to do more. And so that's what we are looking to do, because now that we've taken the time to lean out the entire process, which also includes a big chunk of the building of a building, it would be our goal to do something very similar to this with the building of a building. Far more complicated, but we'd like to try to set up something like that. And so what else can I recommend as I kind of conclude here? What else can I recommend for those of you who are thinking about looking at this, is to really take the time to analyze the steps and to improve the process. And while legislation changes and regulatory changes might be a part of it, it's a minor part. It is almost always some kink in the wheel of the process, and you've got to get into the nitty-gritty with it. We had several attorneys who have opened up hundreds of restaurants, but they only know their part. And we had plenty of municipal folks who only knew their part, but they only knew their part, and nobody knew the whole cycle. And nobody was aware of what everybody else had to do. But when you got them all in a room, it forced them to recognize that this decision affected that 1-5 down the road. And so getting everybody in the room was really important. If I was going to do it over again, what would I do? I would have staff geared towards this. We started doing this just sort of as a side project, and the next thing we knew, it was completely consuming us. I would have the dollars up front and the commitment from the leadership up front. I would also have the IT in place. What we realized was so many of these transactions were done on paper, and that it really led to a much larger conversation of getting far more of this done electronic. We would also make sure you would want to have levels of support from all of government, because just our department is what we started with, and then we had to expand and grow. It would have been nice if we had everybody's support from the beginning. So I wouldn't change that. But I'll also say probably the biggest thing is you have to have a passion for it, because this is long and arduous and hard work to do. And if somebody's not passionate about doing it and pushing it, anytime you hit a roadblock, you're going to pull back and not likely want to continue on. And there are going to be big roadblocks that come by you. There's going to be lots of people who say, you can't do that, or it's impossible. But that's why you're doing it, right? Because we know it's really hard. So those are sort of the insights from the state of Rhode Island on what we did to open up a restaurant. You can see here, we decided to start with sort of number one. Do you really even want to open up a restaurant? Do you know all the information that you need to know? Second was location, right? And so I really think that first and second, if you can't get past 1 and 2, don't even bother with the rest, because once you've done that and you know that your location is good, then it's time to start thinking about the legal structure, preparing for your location, the final preparation. And then number 6 is, really about success and marketing yourself and growing your restaurant. And so number 1 and number 2 were super critical for us. While you can't see it on the website now, if you click that, it will show you a list of things that you can do a deeper dive on. Number 3 in particular will guide you to every single form that you could possibly need. So for example, in Rhode Island, we have a lot of shellfish. And so you have a special shellfish form. So many people didn't realize that they needed a special shellfish license. So we have everything you could possibly need in that section so that you're at least aware, right? And that was what it was about for us, was making that awareness so that you knew what you had to do. And so I'm very happy to share this information. It's basically, if you Google how to open up a restaurant in Rhode Island, this will come up and you can scroll through it and see. One other quick piece of advice I would offer, we were about to launch it and it had some clams on the front of it. And when I looked at it, those were not Rhode Island clams. And so we knew that if they were not Rhode Island clams, that we would be condemned for having non-Rhode Island clams. And they would say we got a stock photo from somewhere else. So you cannot forget any of the most important things. So make sure that the food and the pictures that you have on your website are all relative to your state and your location, because people don't miss anything for a second. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. And I look forward to taking any questions either this or time or later time.
Liz, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I can always listen to you when you talk about this type of stuff. So thanks again. I believe next we have Director Pender.
Wisty.
Great, thank you so much.
That is not mine. I'll go ahead and start talking while the video part is coming up. I think Katie is working on that. So my name is Wisty Pender, and just because everybody asks, yes, my first name is Wisty. My given name, it's not short for anything. So many things that Liz touched on are very true with what we found in Tennessee. And that sort of idea that, whatever that irritating thing is going to help make the change. So in Tennessee, we have local, state, federal, plus licensing. And so the Tennessee Smart Start Guide, we initiated that as an actual hard copy and then segued it into an interactive online version with the thought that people could do 3 primary things. And that is to, once they create their user profile, they can get a checklist of how to register a business in the state of Tennessee. They get connected to resources based on how they answer their questions. And then they can complete their own business canvas model. And so it looks like it's freezing up a little bit. Hopefully it will keep continuing. And so that was the primary idea behind this. And so this was actually functioning before COVID, but we were in process, thanks to NGA and Pew getting to be a part of the program or the project, I guess, that brought us right into COVID. And so we knew already going into COVID that we had these areas that needed to have some streamlining, whether it was regulatory. Again, it was interesting to hear Liz, because in Tennessee, we do have local, and you could have to get a business license with the city and the county. And people just weren't intentionally not doing the steps. They just didn't understand what steps there were. And so really a checklist, a simple checklist of the, hyperlink where people can follow the steps and then they know who to ask when they need help is the, yes, please play it. It doesn't have to have volume. Thank you. I was just letting people see it run. So this is the intro video to it. So when somebody comes on, this gives them how to kind of the general overview of how to get started and what to do. And I had the last one, Liz said that, they didn't have the right clams on the picture, and we're a big state. And so it was really important to include from Memphis to East Tennessee. And so visual representation is there across the state as part of that too, because we know that that's one of the big things is people want to see things that they identify with, that they're part of it. I come from, I've had small businesses myself. My parents always had their own businesses. And so I already had a base familiarity with the challenges that you run into, and that we were in a unique position to help streamline those and to help change that. In our state, we have our Secretary of State is where you actually get your corporate structure, and he's a constitutional officer. So we had some really interesting dynamics that were happening when we talk about how you streamline a business, because, you know, with sole proprietors and general partnerships, we had over 500,000 of those, whereas we might have 150,000 that are registered with the state kind of in the LLC or corporate structure. And so we knew there were some big gaps of where people were just getting lost in that process. So with the guide here, we're continuing to develop different parts of it and bringing in, you know, as people fill out the information to see where people are coming from. In 2021, without any advertising, we had about 248,000 people using this and accessing it. They're spending a lot of time on it, especially on the business model canvas. It's really helpful. It directs them to a variety of places. And then when COVID hit, this also is one of those things people went to because we either have necessity entrepreneurship coming up, or we have people who are hearing about all these programs and they're not really quite sure where to start. And so this became one of those primary tools and also showed us what we needed to do. And COVID actually helped cut down some of the steps that are necessary for us to make progress and actually having this become a true life cycle registration process for businesses to engage in. So we're in that process of true registration. And it's, you know, I'm sure everybody can sympathize with how many different agencies are involved and all the different kinds of things that have to happen in order to make that be successful. And then one other thing I'll touch on is that we're also doing a Smart Start community initiative. So we have community partners in different communities. They self-select, and the idea is to get people to the right resource at the right time. And if there are people in a community who can make that community more inviting, more accessible to the new and existing businesses in their community who are really small, that they'll be, you know, they'll benefit overall as a community. And so we've been doing this Smart Start community initiative. So it is more of a grassroots up, ground up approach to it, whereas the licensing and the process is top down, trying to figure out how to streamline those and smooth it out. So lots of information. It is, to Liz's point, it's a challenge. You constantly run into things, whether it's funding or getting people to give you the information that you need, to people who, well, we've never done that, or we can't do that. It's like, okay, well, I hear you can't do it, but how can you do it? Like, what do we have to do to make it work? And so it's definitely a process, and it definitely keeps it interesting.
Great, Wisty, thank you so much. It's really fascinating to hear about how the pandemic kind of opened some doors in terms of getting these processes moving along. So thank you so much for your time. Next, I believe we have EJ Kalafarsky.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. It's super exciting to hear about all these peer efforts in other states. No slides from me, but I'll invite everybody to check out business.nj.gov if you'd like to see what we're about. And over the next couple minutes, I'll try to focus a little bit on the technology that we're using to kind of attack the problem of creating a one-stop shop in New Jersey. At the New Jersey Office of Innovation, we're building business.nj.gov as a kind of hub among the spokes of every agency at New Jersey that has requirements for businesses. About 3 years ago, we started by doing a census of every requirement that New Jersey businesses could potentially need to fill out across all New Jersey state agencies, and we stopped counting at 1,700. We counted and named at least 1,700 forms, filings, permits, licenses, et cetera, that you could potentially be responsible for as a business across 15 state agencies. Much like Liz and Wisty described in their states, we have attacked the problem by turning business.nj.gov into a front door where to go for any information as a business in New Jersey when you don't know which of the 15 state websites, agency websites to go to. Since we launched it 2 years ago, it's served over 2.5 million unique users. We edit and actively maintain the content on business.nj.gov on a daily basis. We publish weekly statewide email newsletters for the business community, and we offer a live chat in the corner of the website. Not a bot, but actual real live humans who will respond with whatever question that you have from the state's Business Action Center. Several agencies are involved in that effort, and your question can be seamlessly transferred to specialists at each agency. But finally, in terms of features on the site, and most germane for what I'll talk about in these couple minutes or so, we've got a tool called the Navigator that is meant to be, the holy grail of giving you as a business that personalized guide for everything that you need to do as a business across all state agencies and federal and county and municipal jurisdictions. Similar to what Wisty was describing with Smart Start, it's meant to give you that comprehensive personalized guide. And then our end goal is to eventually let you do all those interactions in the one stop, in one place, instead of just pointing you at those 15 different New Jersey state websites. The other panelists have talked really eloquently about the problems of building these knowledge bases and journey maps and documenting requirements. So I'll just focus here for a minute on the underlying technology that we're using in New Jersey to power kind of that goal of a one stop for all those interactions in our Navigator tool. We provide the personalized checklist for the general process of starting a business, and for 20 specific industries at this point as well. 12,000 active users have created those personalized roadmaps since we launched the Navigator on November 1st. The underlying the principle that we're adopting to try and make it possible to do all those interactions right there in our Navigator experience as you're getting that checklist is to unify the interactions in one place, but do it in a way that's as easy and painless as possible for the agencies in the state to opt into. Each agency obviously has their own way of processing all the forms and regulatory requirements already. They have their own legacy computer systems. Some of them are in the process of building new systems to modernize those, but they're, in New Jersey, as in other places likely, they're doing it in their own way with their own technology. Our goal is specifically to avoid telling any particular agency that they have to start over or adopt our preferred technology, because that's a long process, and that is harder to get agencies to opt into. What we want, as opposed to telling any agency to rip out their current infrastructure, the underlying approach that we've adopted is a toolkit of technologies that allows us to provide and plug into a kind of like connective tissue between the state agencies without interfering or changing any of the existing processes at agencies. And the hope is that they find this to be a particularly painless way to opt into, to plug into our system. Without getting too technical, our technology toolkit consists of a few options to connect to existing systems for agencies that are sophisticated and have their own technology capability, and perhaps even vendors to help them out with this. We work with them to define what's called in the industry an API, which is a common language for requesting or sending data between disparate systems between agencies. The agency gets total control over how their API responds to a request. So it's incredibly secure, and it avoids a lot of the traditional need for like an MOU that restricts how the data, that defines how the data can be accessed. The agency just controls the access themselves, and we advise on and consult on creating that capability for themselves. For agencies that don't have so much of a technological capacity, we have a platform on state contract called Boomi. This is a company that came out of Dell Computer. And in a nutshell, it's a platform that makes it very easy for us, for our business.nj.gov Navigator, again, at the hub of those agency spokes, to plug into existing databases at the different spokes on the wheel, to plug into an existing database, a database of any technology, and read data out of it about a particular business, or write data into it with the permission of the agency. If the business has done that interaction, put that data into our Navigator. So again, this kind of puts us at the hub of being able to piece together all information about a business from the different computer systems throughout the state where it lives at different agencies. So what we're building with business.nj.gov is a kind of additive home base for someone who's looking to start or manage their business in New Jersey. We haven't replaced any of the traditional ways of filing or managing any of the interactions that you need to as a business. You can still file your formation documents at the Department of Treasury website. You can still apply for your license at the Division of Consumer Affairs website. You can apply for your permits at the Department of Environmental Protection website. But if you'd rather, instead of becoming an expert in 15 different state websites, if you'd rather do that all in one place, and we suspect that you might, you can do that all at business.nj.gov within the personalized guide that we're generating for you. You can do the interactions right there in the guide as well, that list of everything that you need to do as a business. And the appropriate data that you submit or the form that you fill out seamlessly flows from business.nj.gov to each appropriate database at each agency where it needs to go, and where it's always gone to be processed. And so we've been able to set this up quite quickly. So the technology approach is to be additive and forgiving, and we've put together a toolkit of tools to help us do that. And we're always happy to talk about in more detail about it.
Great, EJ, thank you so much for your time. That all sounds incredibly complex, but also useful. So I'm sure we'll have some questions for you at the end of the session. And so finally, last but not least, we have Ellen Harpel. Ellen, so good to see you, and thank you so much for your time.
All right, well, thank you, Shane, and thank you, NGA and Pew, and all the speakers here today for giving me the chance to talk to you and for the chance to work on this project. So I had the really great job of talking to the state teams who have been creating or updating their one-stops, hearing their stories, and then thinking about what are the lessons learned from these practice leaders, and what does it mean for states and especially governors' offices who are interested in pursuing similar efforts. And the descriptions and takeaways are all going to be included, as Shane said, in a forthcoming paper, which is tentatively titled, or maybe finally titled, Evolving State One-Stops Offer New Ways to Help Businesses. And that's one of the reasons that we are thinking about that as the title is because I think one of the most important takeaways from this effort has been learning that one-stops are always evolving. They are changing and responding to expectations and the current environment. It's really not just a set it and forget it effort, because even if we just think about what's happened in the past couple of years in terms of technology changes, expectations for how online interactions happen and the kind of the quality of those interactions. And of course, the entire operating environment can suddenly change. So again, rather than thinking about these as just a project, we're going to do it and we're going to be done, I think it's really valuable to think about it as an ongoing, evolving service. But I also want to go back to Liz's point in her presentation about being passionate and committed about this. When I first began this effort, I really had no idea how interesting and impactful these efforts really are, and really the level of commitment behind them to bring them to the state that Liz, Wisty, and EJ were describing. It actually is a topic you can and maybe should be passionate about. Now, in terms of lessons and takeaways, there are a lot of important issues that are related to technology and other specifics when you're implementing one-stops that all of our speakers have described. But our report is really about the policy takeaways for governor's offices. So it's at a little bit of a higher level. And I'll go through those one by one and happy to answer any questions about them. So the first one is to leadership at the top, the governor's office. It's very helpful if the governor's office identifies one-stops as a state priority. Sustained leadership from the governor's office can really be critical, because without it, often neither the resources nor the cross-agency commitment needed for implementation are likely to materialize. So leadership from the top can be necessary, certainly valuable, to bringing everyone together and making it happen. A second one is to show value to the participating agencies to sustain their collaboration and commitment after the first initial push. I thought that it was interesting that I think everyone specifically said, they didn't go into this tearing up the regulation book, right? It was about making the processes to comply with current regulations just more streamlined and easy to navigate for the businesses or the individuals that are going through the process. And so in keeping with that theme, one of our findings is that the One Stop Initiative has to find some way to give back to the participating agencies to keep them there and to keep them engaged. From the states that we interviewed for this project, we learned that there are a couple of different ways to go about that besides the ones that the speakers have talked about. One is that agencies can really value the access to research and the new insights on usage patterns for their own regulatory procedures. They might not have taken the time to do this before. And so having this new data that a project like this is likely to generate gives them something really valuable in return. They also, of course, really appreciate the availability of additional resources and expertise to get their processes online. Probably everyone has wanted to do this better. And if there's a kind of a centralized fund and source of expertise to make this happen, again, great value. And then finally, metrics that can help all the individual agencies as well as the one-stop overall kind of tell their winning stories to their constituencies. That can also be really helpful to them. A third lesson is orienting work around the customer experience, thinking about what the user experience is rather than the agency process perspective is really critical to success here. And again, leadership from the top can help keep this front and center. So the states that we talked to have used a couple different methods to kind of understand and then solve for the specific problems that have been identified as the business experience challenges in trying to comply with state regulations or requirements. These methods include listening sessions with constituents, so something that many state agencies are probably already doing, tapping into expertise from consultants who specialize in lean processes or enterprise solutions, across agency process mapping conducted internally by state staff. I think this is something that Delaware implemented, and taking advantage of input from your frontline customer service representatives, those people that are on the phone with businesses, and understanding what the pain points are in the process, and then again, solving towards those from the customer and the user perspective. Next is, and related to that, implementing thorough regulatory process mapping, because states often lack a global view of what the business processes look like from the applicant's perspective, especially when it crosses agencies. It's just not been done before. So the business knows what it is, but state government hasn't known what it is, and then to figure out how to make that work better. So there's a lot of value in mapping the business startup process or other business regulatory processes across agencies. And then as EJ was describing, creating those inventories of forms and submission requirements, which means that you can then figure out a way to make it better. Maybe you don't need 1,700 of them. Maybe you do, but maybe you can find ways among them to identify redundancies that can be eliminated and kind of give a structure to the one-stop portal so they don't have to kind of bounce among all the forms. And then as Liz said, and I think everyone had kind of alluded to, what you'll probably find by doing this is that relatively small fixes in process can really create big improvements from the user's perspective and create a lot more happy business customers in your state. Next is offering dedicated funding. Speakers talked about this too. So governors can play a really important role here, or governors' offices, and support one-stop portals by establishing or supporting some sort of a centralized fund to pay for the initiative, at least at the start, rather than asking agencies to pay for it out of their own budgets. But over time, I think states have also found that maybe there should be a way to think about creating a funding mechanism to sustain improvements over time, because again, the technology will change, there will need to be upgrades, expectations will change, and having a way to make those things happen over time, I think will lead to greater long-term success with the portals. But to get started, I just want to be very clear, having something that transcends state agencies to help get the effort off the ground is important. And then last, as I was just suggesting, plan for sustainability. So as I said at the beginning, evolving is sort of one of our keywords, and we learned that the one-stop portal development probably is not just going to be a one-off project for states. So options for planning for sustainability that we heard about from the states included things like, well, creating a portal plan, not just kind of to get it up and running, but kind of thinking about what it might look like over time. If you don't know what it's going to look like over time, you probably don't at least have a process to kind of review or update or create a plan that looks beyond the initial project launch. Using metrics and reporting that are built around the user experience, but also agency efficiencies to continue to make the business case for the portal's future development is something that, that states discussed. And then in general, and this comes back to a role of the governor's office, in kind of promoting this agile mindset that positions the portal as a really valuable resource to businesses, but that can also help individual agencies respond quickly and efficiently to unexpected circumstances and new demands for their services. So that's a quick summary of our takeaways from our report, again, focused primarily on what this might mean for governors and their staffs and roles that they can play. As Shane said, I think that the report is going to be issued later this spring or early this summer, and we look forward to sharing it with you then. And in the meantime, I'm happy to join the panel for any discussion or Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen. That was fantastic. We have a few questions already in the chat here, so I will be sure to go through them. But folks, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to send them along to us, and we'd be happy to address them. I believe the first few questions are for EJ, New Jersey. A few questions around the API. Let's see here. So for platforms that are API driven, who owns the API? Is it your business platform or the individual agencies? And do you intend to shift away from individual applications at agencies so that the user might end up using the business enrollment platforms?
Sure. So the model that we want to encourage is each agency being able to expose its own data in a way that it still controls. So the best possible situation is each agency builds its own API, can control the data that business.nj.gov can access, can control the data that other third-party sites like LegalZoom or whatever might be able to access. That's the ideal situation. I talked about this other tool in our toolkit, the Boomi platform that we use. And if an agency doesn't have the capability of building their own, that's a more centralized way that we can sneak out a tentacle and plug into a database with the agency's cooperation. It's a little bit less flexible and doesn't give the agency as much control if they don't have the capacity to build that themselves. As far as the second question, I talked about what we've done so far as being an additive approach, as the path of least resistance, and kind of like Ellen was talking about, coaxing these agencies into the effort is part of the value proposition here. I think down the road, if we are extremely successful and the market bears out our, our centralized place as a quote unquote better way to enroll as a business, to form your business, to submit some of these permits. We have no problem with it becoming, kind of the primary way to do these things. But we want that to be because it's a better experience, not because users are forced to switch or that the agencies are forced to switch their mechanism.
Okay, great, thank you. And it looks like we have a follow-up question for you, EJ. So with regard to the user interface design of the platform, how were decisions made about designing the interface? Were there user focus group tests or engagement with stakeholders? And I guess more broadly for Liz and for Wisty, I think we'd love to hear more about how or what strategies you employed to kind of get feedback as you designed these great tools along the way.
Sure, I'm sure the other panelists have great answers as well, and I'd like to hear those. At New Jersey, we are constantly testing on a weekly basis. We're recruiting and testing with users and constantly redesigning the experience. We have an agile approach where we're constantly adding new features and rethinking the design and improving the design through user testing and through presenting variants to users to find out what actually works best for them.
So kind of adding to EJ, that's something that's really important. Obviously, the user experience is, we want people to use it, so it has to be very friendly. And so we actually asked our various entrepreneur support organizations, our ESOs, for them to go through it, to actually have kind of test groups for us to give us feedback, and then we took that feedback and made changes and updates. It is an ongoing process for sure. I have a regular kind of process of people who test it out as new updates are made. At this point, I've actually got a bunch of stuff staged on the back end that's going to go live. And so it's that process of, well, what do we need to make it work really well as it's intended to work right now, and then add to it after it's working really well. And so that is definitely part of that process that we do. But our entrepreneur support organizations are key in that too, because they use it and the businesses use it, and we encourage the businesses who do that business canvas model, the resource providers themselves, the entrepreneur support organizations, they're going to them with that as a way to talk about their business. So we need that interaction to work on all sides.
I'll just add that, one thing for us was the restaurant was just the beginning for us. We are actually piloting and testing right now something very similar to what New Jersey is doing. And we're creating a digital identity for a business or a citizen to sort of come into a singular website, retrieve their digital identity by proving who they are via their driver's license, creating a data lake to hold a lot of that common information, Liz Tanner, 123 Main Street, so I don't have to keep entering it over and over again. And then ultimately doing the multiple spokes on a wheel is what we call it. And right now we're starting with the credentialing of accountants. So I saw one of the questions on there is about getting agency participation, and that's a huge problem, right? So I was blessed to have an agency that was mostly already online at about 85%. We're now up to 100%, but there are plenty of other state agencies that are down at 10, 15%, and they're still either on paper or some sort of a fillable PDF. And so, I can get everything in my agency on a system, but if it doesn't connect with those other state agencies, that's where the hassle is. And so trying to get everybody onto an electronic system that can connect via an API is a real challenge. I'd love to hear how other states have taken care of it, because it's a real challenge for us as well.
Great, thank you, EJ, Liz, and Wisty. Excuse me. We have another question here. So a lot of folks on the panel have mentioned accessibility. So as you build new tools, how can states make sure that they don't leave out individuals served by more traditional forms of assistance, especially for those with disabilities that rely on tools that states have built up over the years. So I think definitely a great question here about flexibility as things progress in a more tech-heavy world.
I'll just say that
I'll add one thing to.
Oh, sorry. All right,
So go ahead, Liz.
So we also have an electronic permitting system, and so in all 39 of our, it's in just about all of our 39 municipalities. So each of those municipalities now has an iPad or multiple iPads, depending on the size of the municipality, so that they can come to a municipal government to at least do their permitting for building. And so we'd like to grow that ability so that someone at least has a local resource if they don't have a phone, but at least it's within their town. And so that's the accessibility that we're looking at doing. But to someone's point earlier, you have to invest in it. You have to make sure everybody's trained, right? So it's not as simple as having a book. You need to make sure that the technology works and that it's up to date and that somebody's able to train the person who's coming in to use it. So those are just my comments.
Those are good points. One, obviously in the testing of it, it's mobile friendly. We have people check it in various languages to see how the translations are working. And then, through one of our agencies, if somebody's having challenges that we're not able to solve because the visual is not working out, we know who we can send them to so that they can get help directly in the way that makes the most sense for them. But especially that visual impairment, making sure that it's readable for them in the process. So it is something that we have top of mind as we develop more things and try to find solutions for them. I won't say that we are 100% accessible across the board, but we're definitely striving towards that.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. I think from our perspective, it's sort of about constant investment in testing in accessibility and being usable by all users, but particularly accessibility users as well. So it's about testing, and it's about making sure that the industry standards for accessibility can and should be applied at every step of the process, so that industry standard devices like screen readers and other such standard devices can access every part of the experience that we're building. Finally, I think we try to present as flexible ways of getting information as possible. There's search functionality, there's browsing functionality, there's the live chat feature that I mentioned, but we've still got the old analog phone number, 1-800-Jersey-7 on that website as well. So it's all about finding all the different ways to make sure that information can get to users of all stripes.
And one more thing I'll add too is, that was part of the impetus behind Smart Start Communities, is because if you're actually educating people and getting them familiarized with what the resources are, the ultimate goal is getting them to the right resource at the right time, but getting that familiarization, because Tennessee is a really big state, it's very rural. And so making sure that people who maybe aren't as adept with using the online tools, you're introducing them to it in a way with people that they trust. They're going to be better about segueing into it, or at least going to those people and asking for help, because that point of contact is someone that they trust, and that's really important. Also, something that was super magnified during COVID is people being able to connect with people that they trust in order to take advantage of programs. So
great, that was great. And EJ, I definitely am a person who appreciates being able to call and speak to a human being from time to time. So I know at least you'd have one fan over here in Maryland. We have a great question here related to tracking time savings. So have any folks here done any analysis to demonstrate the time savings of a business startup using a one-stop versus having to go and search for applications for licenses on each individual agency. And if I could add to that, I'm curious, Wisty, EJ, and Liz, to learn more about any type of tracking or assessments you've been doing related to your one-stops. What type of, have you been able to kind of see any impacts through time savings for businesses? And Ellen, as someone who has studied a fair bit of these, we definitely love to hear your input about some of the metrics that that states and local governments can employ to kind of track the performance of these portals.
So I'm happy to take a look at that one because I've spent a lot of time looking at this. The answer is it's impossible, but yet you could probably make something up. That's kind of what the answer is, because it depends on each singular process and each kind of business type that you're trying to do. We tried to do it exactly for a restaurant to say, okay, now that we've provided all this information, how much time is it going to save? What's it going to work at? And it's because very often when people submit their documents, they don't submit the right information, and then you then have to wait for the right information to come in. It's almost impossible to track it. You can guess, right? You can make some reasonable assumptions as to what things are, but even in my shop where we process probably like several hundred professional licenses. The one thing that we were able to say is for a realtor, when a realtor was becoming professionally licensed, if we did it electronically, it took us 2 hours. If it was done on paper, it was 2 weeks. But that was the analysis that we did because we were trying to really push people to get it online. But a large part of that 2 weeks was people didn't submit exactly what they needed to because they just mailed stuff in versus the computer forced them to send in what we wanted them to send in. So it's really hard to calculate that. I'm often asked, can we start a one-stop shop to open up a business in Rhode Island? We want to do the one in a day. I believe the Obama administration had talked about open a business in a day. You can already open a business in a day, but that gets you your corporate registration, your taxation registration, and you could probably drive to your town hall to do it in one day. But that's just the basic business, right? If you want to open up a restaurant, that's a whole other kind of level of paperwork that you would need to do. And then you're dealing with municipal rules and what you can and can't do. And so you can open a business in a day, probably just about every state in the country. So it's really hard to track it. And you can make assumptions, but everybody's going to be unique unless EJ and Wisty have come up with some other ways for it to be tracked. We've always had a challenge with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, Liz is absolutely right. It's tough and incredibly complicated to quantify anything like that, but it doesn't mean that we're not trying. We have actually over particularly the last 6 months or so had a number of members of our team really trying to tackle this and figure out what can we measure, particularly over the very long term, over 6 months or a year or 2 years after this effort, is really ramped up. How can we begin to quantify the meaningful change or, lowered time or lowered complexity for businesses of certain stripes and certain types and certain demographics, in the state? We started by defining buckets of metrics that we wanted to be able to focus on. Time spent opening a business, our tools' coverage of industries across the state, whether or not we can measure the degree of transparency that we're introducing to each agency, the degree of customer service that we're offering, ensuring equity across all of our efforts. Those are buckets, and within each bucket, we'll need to work on mechanisms for measuring and measuring a baseline, which is where you start, and then somehow measuring the delta over time. Yes, it's incredible. It'll be incredibly difficult, but we are making that effort and at least now laying the groundwork to be able to come back to that 6 months or a year from now and say, have we meaningfully moved the needle for businesses in any of those domains?
Just to chime in on this part of the conversation, to confirm, of course, yes, that this is hard to do, and but I'm going to offer 2 lessons that I'm drawing from our work on business incentives. One is when things are complex like this, co-creating instead of trying to have a top-down approach to metrics can be really helpful. Asking the agencies, for example, what they want to know and what and then thinking together about the data sources that you have combined, they can help get each of you where you want to go. And then second is tying these metrics as much as you can to existing ways that they evaluate themselves or report on themselves, and trying to build on those. And that usually makes it easier for new metrics to take root. So if there's already a strategic planning process or a performance evaluation or an annual reporting process, trying ways to hook the new metrics into some structure that already exists, and from one of those resources can be really helpful in kind of progressing.
EJ and Liz brought up all good ones that do make it a challenge. One thing that we looked at sort of in a way to frame why it was important that we take some of these steps is looking at some businesses who were penalized in the first year, maybe from the tax perspective. And I don't mean maybe that were taxed. And we don't have this as a metric, but I could foresee it being a metric of, because a lot of times people who are penalized in year one, and that tax perspective is, it's either your sole proprietors, maybe some of your corporations are or penalized in one area, and then your corporate structures are penalized in another area in year one. And a lot of times that has nothing to do with anything they did intentionally. They didn't know something, there was some step missed. And so it isn't that we have this as a metric, but I think that could be a metric to look at, is reducing the number of the percentage of tax penalties in year one of businesses. It could be a challenge, but because a lot of it is corollary or you're making certain assumptions, but it is one way you could look at it as an option. That was, like I said, an informal sort of survey, how we looked at it and said, well, this is a justification for why, because we have way too many businesses who are having a negative experience with government in year one of their business. And starting your own business is already a challenge. We don't need to make it harder on them. How do we fix that part?
Great, thank you, everyone. I know it's definitely challenging to come up with important metrics, but I think it sounds like the lesson here is, finding ways to demonstrate the value of these systems. It definitely can come in various ways, whether it's reducing errors or improving time from submission to approval. All definitely important points here to track. I see we do have a couple of minutes left, so we can get to one, maybe two more questions. One question here, I see, when trying to connect different data sources across agencies, has anyone encountered data privacy concerns or laws, or even just some concerns from agencies about, kind of opening up to potentially issues that might deal with data confidentiality? EJ, this sounds like a question for you and for Liz and others as well. So feel free to chime in.
Sure. The answer is yes. I think we've talked about the issue of kind of coaxing agencies to participate. Each agency in the strictest way needs to comply with its own laws and its own regulatory requirements, and that's the path of least resistance for them, which is why we try to make it as easy to opt into kind of a shared service model as possible. That is one of the top concerns for each agency when they're considering participating, and we need to be able to satisfy their need to control the meeting their regulatory requirements, confidentiality requirements, et cetera. I think I talked about helping them build an API that gives them total access over their data and the data of each of their business customers, essentially. There are other technologies that we're working on layering onto the system to help satisfy the needs of more agencies who aren't working with us yet. Identity verification, third-party identity verification services, tying into single sign-on services is something that we do as well. So yes, it's all about, I think working with the agencies to make sure that they're regulatory and security and confidentiality needs are met to entice them to participate.
Liz, I saw you were nodding your head as well.
I mean, I'm not sure what I can add out of this. I absolutely, completely agree with EJ. It's been a challenge for us as well. Particularly when it comes to social security numbers. And this is not with the restaurant project. This is with our digital identity project. It's been a matter of, to a certain extent, we had to first take a look at removing social security numbers and say, we don't need it as part of this process. So why were we asking for it, right? It reduced the chance that there would be data privacy concerns between agencies. And so that was sort of the first exercise, was to really only ask for a social security number when you needed it. So that was sort of the first step for us. But ultimately, yes, it is a concern. Some people are just really afraid of what that looks like. We're constantly pitching to them. It's still all state information, right? It might fall under lots of different umbrellas, but ultimately it's still under the same umbrella. But it's definitely a challenge that we're suffering.
I would agree with that. One thing that, again, COVID being the driver of it, is that on the side where we were looking at how we were going to do it, sort of having the different agencies have their information kind of come up to an overlay, or kind of this mask of sorts, where when somebody puts in their information, that agency, they have their data come in, because we have that. I mean, everybody does, but whether it's Department of Labor or Department of Revenue, who all have these really stringent federal requirements, getting those data sharing agreements across the agencies in ways that they can say, yes, this, applies. That's one thing, obviously, everybody has run into. But one thing that has come up on the side of where we're kind of sorting some things out are on the education side, where we have students, where we're tracking students throughout the process. So if they graduate from high school and then they go to college and they're in a state school, we don't want to lose that, and also that whole carrying credits forward too, so that there's more continuity in there. And so it's sort of acting as this testing ground for it, and then hopefully we'll be able to apply those lessons learned from that, and then also some of the other areas that emerged really only because of COVID forcing that kind of data sharing. And so that is some of the stuff that I know we're looking at. How do we apply what we've learned here and make it work here in a different environment?
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. It looks like we are just about out of time. So Wisty, EJ, Liz, Ellen, thank you so much for your time. This was a whole lot of information here, and a whole lot of really important information. So we appreciate you sharing. Thanks again. And it looks like we are going to be transitioning to a small break, and we'll come back at around 1:25 with our next session. Thank you all so much.
Good afternoon. Would somebody nod their head and let me know if you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Wonderful, thanks. So we are in the midst of our NGA Pew event on reviewing and streamlining state regulations and portals for businesses. It's been really informative so far, and we're really looking forward to this next session on state regulatory reviews and cross-agency inventories. I'm Sally Rood, Senior Policy Analyst here at the NGA Center for Best Practices, and I'll be moderating the second session focused on, again, state regulatory reviews, cross-agency inventories, and other state strategies. In this session, you will hear from the authors of our upcoming publication on this topic, as well as two representatives of states that have done a great deal of work in this area. James Brule is an adjunct professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School and a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dustin Chambers is a professor of economics in the Purdue School of Business at Salisbury University and a senior affiliated scholar for the Mercatus Center. And our state speakers are Sarah Chambers and Ronnie Hines. Sarah is the director of Alaska's Division of Corporations, Business and Professional Licensing. She's a former elected official and also works with the Council on Licensure, Enforcement, and Regulation. Ronnie Hines is director of the Colorado Division of Professions and Occupations, where she regulates more than 50 professions and 15% of the state's workforce. During their presentations, please feel free to input your questions for the panelists through the Q&A function. And we'll begin with our paper authors and then hear from our state respondents on a state perspective. So James, I'm turning it over to you at this point.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Sally. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thank you to NGA and Pew for inviting us to speak today. My name is James Brohl, and this presentation is based on research conducted by myself and Dustin Chambers of Salisbury University. We've written a report that will be out in the next few months, hopefully, discussing state efforts to streamline their regulatory systems. So states are finding innovative ways to make public interactions with the government more user-friendly. And these efforts are saving businesses time and money and thereby helping contribute to economic growth. So our report is structured around specific state strategies for reviewing regulations, in particular, creating inventories to catalog rules and restrictions. So creating an inventory of rules can be a helpful first step for a state or for an agency that's looking to get a handle on all the rules and requirements they have under their purview. So data from these inventories can then be used to set management goals for regulatory agencies and for their rules. Notably, the efforts we've looked at have been decidedly bipartisan in nature. There's a very diverse group of states that have conducted regulatory reviews like this in the last few years, including Colorado, Idaho, Kentucky, and Rhode Island. We also look at Arizona, Missouri, New Jersey, and Ohio in the report. You can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we look at several state strategies that they helped use to help guide their regulatory reviews. And that's how our report is organized. And so these include creating inventories, as I discussed, also setting goals for the reform and reporting on those goals in a transparent manner, identifying measures that can be used to track progress of the reform, using regulatory analysis or regulatory impact analysis or assessment of some form to help guide efforts, communication of reform through outreach efforts and marketing in order to engage with the public, reporting to the governor so that the decision makers have the best possible information, oversight and enforcement mechanisms, and then finally ensuring sustainability of reform so that the reforms can continue after a governor leaves office. So for the rest of this talk, I'll go over some of the different practices that states have engaged in these areas. I'll get through about half of them, and then my co-author Dustin will review the remaining ones. So you can go to the next slide. So first is rule inventories and catalogs. So here we have the idea that an agency might have hundreds or even thousands of rules on the books. And the question is, how is it going to review all of them? I've even heard from agencies in my past experience when engaging with them at the state level and the federal level that sometimes there's just too many rules and they don't know where to start. So creating an inventory of rules is a way to make this daunting task of having to review hundreds of regulations more manageable. So you can go to the next slide. Arizona is a state that provides a good example here. So under Arizona law, state agencies first, they have to conduct a review of their administrative rules every 5 years. And Governor Doug Ducey leveraged this process as part of his regulation rollback initiative, which has been ongoing throughout his administration. You can go to the next slide. So as part of these reviews, agencies have had to capture information about each rule that they have on the books. This includes the authorization for the rule, the objective of the rule, so what it's trying to achieve, if the rule is actually achieving that objective, whether the rule has any inconsistencies with other rules or statutes on the books, the extent to which the regulation is enforced, and whether the regulation is written in clear and understandable language. Now, the amount of discretion an agency holds can vary substantially from rule to rule. And so it's important that as part of reviews, agencies determine whether they even have the discretion to amend a particular regulation that they may have identified as in need of updating. So when it has discretion, the agency can move forward and rewrite the regulation, promulgate a new rule. But if it doesn't have that authority, then it may have to go to the state legislature or even go to the federal government in order to seek permission to make the update. So it's important to get this information. And so as part of Arizona's reviews, we can go to the next slide, the one with the chart, if you have it. It's the next one, actually. Yep. So as part of Arizona's most recent rule inventory, the state found that it had 11,222 rules in place. In total, 57% were classified as discretionary, 29% were required by state statute, and 9% were required by federal law. So you can see that most of the regulations that agencies have on the books in Arizona, the agency does have the authority to move forward and update the regulation on its own if need be, but almost a third of the regulations would require some sort of change in state legislation. And only about 10% of regulations would require a federal law to change so that before the agency could update it. But these numbers do vary considerably by agency. And so in Arizona, they report this information broke down by agency. And so some agencies, most of their regulations are required by federal law. Other agencies, the vast majority of them are discretionary. So this is just the aggregate statistics. So it does vary a lot by agency. You can go to the next slide. So governors and their administrations should be clear about what they're trying to accomplish with their reforms. And this can be accomplished by communicating goals for the reforms and through transparent data releases and reporting about how regulations are being amended as part of reviews. We can go to the next slide. An example here is Kentucky. So in 2016, Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin launched a regulatory review effort called the Red Tape Reduction Initiative, for which a website was created at redtapereduction.com. And individuals could go to the website and report regulations that they felt were outdated or unnecessary or overly complex. Governor Bevin set a 30% reduction goal for the state's regulations. The state produced an online inventory of rules, and the public could go on the website and look at the inventory and track how regulations were being updated as part of this review. In total, there were 4,700 state regulations in force at the time, and the administration repealed 628 and amended 693. And you could go on and see exactly how all the regulations were amended. Go to the next slide. Measurement, as I mentioned, is also important. So states have used a variety of different metrics to gauge whether their reforms are achieving their intended goals. These include things like reduced wait times for permits, hours spent filling out paperwork, counts of complaints on a regulation, money expended or saved by consumers or businesses. But measurement could also include things like counts of rules or pages or requirements, word counts, or cost estimates or benefit estimates, like in a cost benefit analysis. Or it could include things like comparing how the number of regulations issued each year has changed over time. The key point is that measurement acts like a compass that allows the regulatory streamliner, in this case, to head towards their destination. Without measurement, they're like a captain who's likely to get lost at sea. So you can go to the next slide. The state of Rhode Island underwent a number of significant regulatory changes under the administration of Governor Gina Raimondo. So we heard from Liz Tanner from her administration just a few minutes ago. In 2016, Governor Raimondo signed a law updating the state's Administrative Procedure Act. At that time, Rhode Island was one of only 2 states that didn't have a consolidated administrative code. So it didn't have all of its rules compiled in one place. The other was Arkansas. And this legislation put a sunset provision on the state's administrative rules. So they'd have to be refiled by the beginning of 2019. And any that weren't refiled would expire. And so the purpose of doing this was to incentivize agencies to put their rules into the new electronic system so that the rules could be compiled into a code. Governor Raimondo set a 15% reduction goal for the state's rule volume. At the outset of the initiative, there were about 1,400 executive branch regulations. And as part of this effort, they revised or eliminated about 77% of the regulations. Rhode Island also adopted new cost benefit analysis requirements, whereby regulations would have an economic analysis, and along with the regulation and analysis, they would undergo a review process by the State Office of Regulatory Reform. And this process was modeled after the federal OMB review process for regulations. Lots of rules were amended or updated as part of this review, from notary requirements, underground storage tank rules. A couple examples, there was a motor vehicle tax regulation from the State Division of Taxation that was consolidated from 16 regulations into a single regulation. And there was a regulation implementing the federal WIC program that was streamlined from 672 pages down to just 29 pages. Next slide. Finally, regulatory assessment and analysis. So I just mentioned Rhode Island implemented some new cost benefit analysis requirements, but some other states have also used economic analysis to guide their regulatory review efforts. And this can help an administration prioritize which regulations are amended and which are updated or discarded. Analysis helps make reforms more evidence-based, so it's more likely that rule changes are benefiting the state, the public, and improving welfare. Next slide. In 2019, Idaho underwent a major regulatory overhaul. So around the same time as Rhode Island, they have an annual sunset provision for their rules in Idaho, which requires annual reauthorization from the legislature. In 2019, the legislature did not reauthorize the administrative code. And so this gave Governor Brad Little and his administration an unprecedented opportunity, really, to rewrite the entire administrative code in a more streamlined, less complex, and easy to understand manner. Now, this sunset of the administrative code did receive a fair amount of attention, but there were other reforms as part of this effort too that didn't get as much attention at the time. So for example, there was a new prospective analysis form that the state budget department required new regulations to have. This form asked agencies to define the problem they're trying to solve, identify different solutions to that problem, including non-regulatory measures, and to compare the proposed regulation to solutions offered in other states or rules in other states. And the forms also were used to track and manage the volume of regulatory activity issued each year, including the overall number of words in the code and the number of restrictive terms in the code. In our conversations with officials in Idaho, we learned that some of the regulations that were amended as part of this process involved the provision of telehealth services. So as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, they relaxed some restrictions that made it easier for people to travel or do telehealth services with mental health professionals in other states. The Department of Labor lifted some requirements that affected the processing of unemployment insurance claims, which is important when unemployment was rising in 2020. And the state also streamlined some of its requirements related to seeking grant funding for different programs. So they made it easier for the agency to change things like deadlines without having to actually amend its regulations. We can go to the next slide. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to my co-author, Dustin, and he's going to review some of the remaining lessons from the states we looked at. This is my contact information if you're interested in reaching out to me. Thanks.
Thanks, James. So I'm going to pick up where James left off and talk about the next really important aspect of reform efforts. And you can advance it to the next slide, please. And this involves outreach efforts and marketing, which really encapsulates two broad concepts. The first idea, if we take a step back, is that reform initiatives oftentimes end up defining a governor's time in office. It's usually one of the largest accomplishments that they have. And at a very minimum, at least, when governors embark upon reform efforts, it sends a very clear signal to the general population and to the business community that they value entrepreneurship and dynamism. The second major idea encapsulated here is this idea that in order to have successful reform, you need to have a mechanism and strategy in place to solicit feedback from stakeholders in the general public. The states that we've looked at that have been particularly successful in this regard have created special purpose websites dedicated to this specific task. And they have done a very good job of soliciting information on those websites, looking for input from the general community and business community regarding which regulations have given them problems and which agencies have also been a sticking point in their efforts to do business. Missouri, next slide, please, is an exemplar in this area. Then Governor Eric Greitens in 2017 launched something called the Nomo Red Tape Initiative. This particular effort, like most of the efforts discussed in the report and in today's presentation, began as an executive order from the governor. And he asked that an extensive review be conducted at all the various agencies, looking to analyze the existing regulations on the books and to also produce a comprehensive report based on their findings. They built a special purpose website in which businesses and other members of the public could identify regulations that were giving them problems and provided specific examples of agencies that were impacting them, and also asking for input from the general public with regard to what actions the administration should take in order to reduce those pain points and make the process more efficient and user-friendly. Next slide, please. The Greitens administration was particularly noteworthy because their outreach efforts were very fruitful. They received over 5,000 comments from the general public, which is far more than you typically find with most outreach efforts. One of the ways that they were able to achieve this extraordinary success was through accountability measures. Specifically, there were specific individuals designated at each of the regulatory agencies who had the responsibility of collecting and ensuring that this input was received. So there's a point person at every one of those agencies. And they used a myriad of techniques to try to solicit feedback. So public meetings were used where stakeholders could gather. Meetings with industry and advocacy groups also took place. But they didn't stop there. They went as far as going to the Missouri State Fair and also setting up a table and asking people at the fair about which regulations were causing problems for their small businesses. In addition to also using social media and interacting with the press to obtain more feedback. So it was a multi-pronged effort to obtain as much input as they possibly could. Next slide, please. The next area that we want to cover is reporting to the governor. So James had mentioned earlier that measurement's a vitally important aspect to a reform process, but then you have to have a way of measuring, consolidating, analyzing, and then reporting that information. So this is just a natural part of that information flow process. It's critical for governors to obtain this information, not only for them to learn what potential problem points might be during the initial assessment, but it also is an important and transparent way in which they can transmit the results and the accomplishments that have been achieved to the general public through subsequent follow-on reports. Useful reports often will include specific statistics and figures, specific listings of how many rules were impacted or reformed, estimates of the cost savings and time savings related to compliance, and the substance of specific rules that were changed. Next slide, please. So Colorado really stands out in this regard, although many states have done a good job of this. In 2011, then Governor John Hickenlooper launched something called the Pits and Peeve Initiative, in which, among other things, lean manufacturing and lean management techniques were brought in to try to streamline overall public sector activities. A total of 92% of Colorado's then 24,000 rules were reviewed, and roughly a quarter of them were modified and 4,500 of them were repealed. Now, when regulations were updated, a lot of statistics were recorded, including the number of customers or citizens impacted, total time saved, and money saved. This information was then reported to the general public through a series of informative and large format reports. Next slide, please. By 2017, these collective efforts had resulted in annual savings of just under $8 million per year and an estimated 2.2 million hours of time saved. These savings came from a lot of different sources, including the elimination of redundant paperwork within various state forms and the streamlining of various licensing processes. Colorado was also noteworthy for leveraging technology, as the previous panel discussed, as an integral feature of trying to improve the quality and efficiency of government. They moved a lot of forms online and then made it easier for businesses to file forms and report information online, and also changed the way that they proceeded with enforcement actions, prioritizing those enforcement actions based on a metric of risk. The final issue that I'm going to talk about today deals with the sustainability of reforms. As mentioned earlier, most of these reforms come about as a result of executive actions through various executive orders, which is fine, but such changes usually are not durable unless a governor goes one step further and then seeks to have these reforms codified into a state statute. So a good example of that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, is Arizona with Governor Ducey, who has currently introduced legislation to try to codify into law their existing reform effort, including their 1 in 3 out law. As of the time of this presentation, that bill has cleared the state house. I believe it is in the state Senate, so it has not yet been passed. So that is it. If you are interested in any of the information that's contained in this report that's not addressed there or addressed later on in the Q&A, feel free to reach out to James or myself. I did not put my contact information here within the slides, but you can find my email address online through a simple Google search, or I can paste it into the chat feature below. I've got a concluding slide here, but it basically lists all of the areas that we just covered within the report. So I want to preserve the extra time that we have for the other panelists and additional Q&A as it comes up. Thank you so much.
No worries about the contact information. We'll have that on a sheet late at the end of the session. Thank you. Sarah?
Good morning. Hi, it's good morning here in Alaska. I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the director of the Division of Corporations, Business and Professional Licensing here in the Last Frontier. And our agency, we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Just by way of By way of introduction, our agency is an umbrella regulatory agency that encompasses 43 different licensing programs. There are 21 boards. Sorry, I didn't start my video. Hi. 21 licensing boards, and that includes about 150 board members, and 22 programs that do not have governing boards that I get to regulate in the stead of a board, and more than 200 different professions within all those. Included are all of our business licensing and corporations functions. So what I wanted to start out with was sort of asking the question of the problem, which all of our speakers have addressed. I don't think Alaska has anything really unique to add in ways of problems, but I think that looking at our issues helps to frame how do we resolve the sort of the friction or the concerns that we have. And so we had a couple of different things happening at the same time. You'll see from this slide that our demand for professional licensing and business licensing has increased dramatically over the last couple of years. And just to give you an idea of our scope, this is the level of increase that we've seen. So next slide. We've been kind of referring to, as probably many of you have, the last couple of years as the perfect storm. So I've shamelessly edited this cartoonist depiction with COVID-19, but also the workforce shortage that many sectors are experiencing, and government, at least in Alaska, is not immune to that. And so many of our solutions have really depended on resource availability and allocation. The main focus of our division, just out of necessity, is professional licensing. And we are currently facing a 20% deficit in workforce. We have 20% of our available positions are vacant, and that's actually an improvement over 30% from last fall. The Harvard Business Review has called this a great resignation. It's due to a lot of reasons that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but trying to continue what we started pre-COVID with the partnership of NGA and Pew and many of you on this call was derailed as the introduction alluded to, and because of COVID. And so we've seen this perfect storm of the demand in healthcare licensing, the demand in nursing. Demand for nurses grew 16% over the last year. And the expectations, as Liz called it, the concierge level service, we call it the Amazon Prime expectation, that people can push a button and become an engineer or become a nurse or become a construction contractor in the state. And as we all know, government exists for many reasons, but one of the prime reasons, especially in licensing, is to protect the public, to make sure that their workforce that requires government regulation is educated and has the training that is necessary to ensure safety. So we've had this increase in demand of numbers of licensure and the way that we deliver it, while we have a decrease in personnel services. Next slide. So one of the ways that we've responded, which we started again prior to COVID, but it's really been accelerated, is what practices and activities can we pause? And we're really looking on this slide at processes. Are there processes, again, that Liz mentioned, that that maybe we're doing that are customary, that are nice to do, but not necessarily legally required? Or are we doing it in a way that is sort of making more work than is necessary? So my staff is reviewing down to the granular level, how are we processing particular applications? What's the workflow look like from either an online entry into licensing or a paper entry into licensing? We, mostly because of our rural nature and issues with internet connectivity, we do have to have paper applications for all more than 200 different license types, which equates to more than 1,000 different applications we have to maintain. So we're looking at how do we encourage our boards to maybe push pause on some of their initiatives that are not directly related to this streamlining effort. Is it something that can be paused? And then looking at, again, those extra make work or nice to do, that concierge level service that we might need to put off in favor of processing that core license. And then the question that we're going to be asking when we sort of get caught up, when we get fully staffed, when we're able to identify improvements and see improvements work, is which of these could be made permanent? And I think that's a question that we've looked at today as well, is what is the silver lining of COVID? Wisty mentioned some things that we've learned in the last couple of years that are really a benefit of coming out of COVID. So those are areas that we're looking at as well, and I'll have some examples. Next slide, please. So looking at some specifics, as many of our speakers have addressed, looking at technology improvements, we are on the beginning stages of looking at technology improvements and trying to implement things like AI, chat features, sort of a enhanced portal. We have a very rudimentary licensing portal. Again, resource allocation is difficult in our IT sector as well. So we're in line with all of the other agencies to have this resource allocated to us. We don't have our own IT. So, but looking at customer communication, we have implemented a customer contact form that really centralizes the response, and we've repurposed administrative staff to deal with the and route appropriately the questions that come in through this customer service contact form. And that's also allowed some protection for our licensing staff, where questions used to go directly to a board staff member or division program staff member. There's a shield or a passageway that gets screened so that can be triaged and say, hey, we don't need our licensing staff to be addressing that. We can have an administrative staff person addressing it. And that's been really helpful for some of the more ministerial functions that we don't need our licensing experts to take time doing. So we're also developing a dashboard to make sure that we're aware of processing times and license completion times. And one area to touch on too with resource allocation is that we are looking at restructuring our licensing teams. This is really important because we can't support the regulatory efforts if we don't have people. And so making sure that we're paying our employees appropriately, that they're structured for reduction in barriers, that we're empowering our staff members to be able to make decisions. Like Liz said, if you're in charge of a program, why can't you be in charge of the forms for that program and helping make those decisions when you're the boots on the ground person who sees where those barriers or that friction might exist. So those are some areas that we're looking at as well. Next. So one of the main components that I think really gets to the heart of today's topic is what authority, as Dustin mentioned, where does the authority lie to be able to make certain decisions and to have them stick and to have them live on? And we're partnering with members of the legislature and certain committees in the state legislature to bring to their attention either bills that have been introduced that are forecast to be introduced in the next legislative session, and encouraging their partnership in adopting statutory changes such as empowering our boards to be able to set telehealth licensing standards and issue licenses that are specific to telehealth, which is a huge conversation nationally, but again, especially in Alaska. Looking at streamlining compacts, data-driven decisions that boards are empowered to make. Next slide. One of the tools that we've provided our boards to utilize is a right touch regulation workbook. I created a 21-page workbook for boards to sit down, or for our staff to sit down and work through what are the right touch regulation processes to identify the problem, assess the risks or hazards with the problem, different ways to manage the necessary problem that is presented in state regulation. What are the consequences of that management, and how flexible is that management? Looking at licensure versus a registry versus a consumer protection outcome that may not require an upfront license. How do we really rethink what we're doing here? We don't have to do things the way we've always done it. Some of that goes to board interpretation of law, looking at a more broad interpretation of how a standard can be set, as opposed to a very narrow interpretation that may not fit today's workforce. And then the last slide, please. I just wanted to wrap up by saying that this is really a culture change. We're talking about regulatory climate change really goes to the culture, and that's something that's been baked into the previous speakers as well. We have to look at the context of today's workforce. We have to look at the context of what are the hazards, what are the concerns that are presented, and make sure that our touch on those regulations are appropriate. And that starts by, as we've mentioned from the top, it also applies to the hearts and minds of your workforce, making sure that your rank and file employees understand these customer service expectations. Again, challenging the way that you've always done it, and looking at how do we engage our volunteer boards or other stakeholders to come along with us in this culture change. So I know that was very speedy, but I'm happy to share more information later on and through the Q&A. Thank you.
So next up is Ronnie. I want to make sure we're all, okay, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, I'm Ronnie Hines. I'm the Division Director for the Division of Professions and Occupations housed in the Department of Regulatory Agencies in Colorado. So next slide, please. So today, I'm hoping to cover a little bit of some of the key areas where Colorado has seen quite a bit of change, and also some success in streamlining our processes. I think we have historically really focused on that and been a leader in regulation. And we've been able to improve our customer service and ensure regulations are not overly burdensome. I wanted to give a little bit of a lens of what our department looks like, because it really is an umbrella department, as well as we are an umbrella agency. So you can see here, DPO is one of many different divisions housed under regulatory agencies. We are the largest division. We have over 500,000 licensees and 200 employees. And similar to Alaska, we have more than 23 boards and commissions, with the remaining programs having oversight by me as the director. And I also want to highlight, as we move through the presentation, how our centralization efforts have really worked in practice, and I'll share that in a minute. And then I'll wrap up with regulatory culture and innovation. And we really do have a culture based on centralization of our functions and lean efforts. As was noted in an earlier presentation, Governor Hickenlooper really focused on the lean culture. And this has really become ingrained in everything we do, and our employees' culture and mindset as well. And it's helped us provide rule reviews, eliminating processes that we don't need to do. For example, like making sure we're really only asking the required questions authorized by statute in our applications, and really trying to be consistent and effective as we do that. So I think next slide. So I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of what that looks like in our division itself. So just a second. So as you can see, we've really tried to organize based on area and function. And so that's really been important for us, because I think that it's really helped us be more consistent and really think about how we can be the least burdensome while protecting consumers and serving our licensees. So you can see We have legal affairs, external affairs, centralized services, which is where our systems and licensing are housed, operations for internal operations, and we also have the programs in one group, and we really do focus on strategic planning. So we regularly conduct rulemaking and rule review for all 50 of our professions, and we do leverage our external affairs team to make sure that we're doing widespread outreach and stakeholder engagement as part of that rulemaking process to really make sure we're incorporating feedback and making sure that we're as least burdensome as we can be, saving money and continuing to impact our rule review process. Interestingly, during COVID, and we are still working remotely as a whole, I feel like our stakeholder engagement has improved because we've so adapted to this virtual world. We're really able to reach people across the state. So that's a great benefit. But as a division, we're really focused on just getting back to the basics, sort of what Sarah described, just what do we really have to do versus what have we always sort of done up above and beyond as we try to serve our licensee and make sure that we focus on the workforce in the state. So we do have centralized functions for licensing, exams, investigations, and like I said, rulemaking and outreach. So that's really made a dramatic difference in how we're able to provide services across the state. So we were one of the states, I think, that moved very early to online applications, which did serve us very well as we moved home very quickly in the pandemic. We were already at 100% of online applications. And that really, the measure of that as part of a lean project resulted in about 23,000 hours of savings annually. We do have online complaint forms, online payments, and as part of our efforts during COVID, we even started doing where we could remote video inspections for plumbing and electrical. So we really did try to move as much function and workflow across the division to limit our unnecessary practices. So next slide. Great. So we have been centralizing and streamlining our processes to benefit customers and consumers. We've cut licensing times. We've reduced the life of a case. We've increased our remote inspections, as I noted. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. And we've also increased outreach and education among professionals. And we've been able to have consistent board and program operations. So with this effort and really focusing on our strategic goals, and again, this is led by Governor Polis, focusing on what we call our wildly important goals, we have demonstrated measurable results to really focus on all of these areas and really eliminate any red tape that we can, leading to fairer outcomes, I think. These WIGs do go to the General Assembly. We report during our SMART Act hearing as a department, and they also go to the governor's office. And I just want to highlight quickly here, we have really seen amazing dedication by our staff, and to Sarah's point, retaining that staff is so important. And again, we've been remote and we're still remote. And so some of our goals included 100% of occupational licenses would be processed or approved within 30 days. Our staff's so amazing, we're at 18 days. We do endorsement applications in 16 days, and we just are continuing to find ways to best serve our customers. So next slide. So here is where I'll sort of highlight more what you've seen in some of the other presentations. So we do have a great history of regulatory reform and rule review, really focusing on government efficiency. That is very much supported by lean implementation and culture. And then in a moment, I'll highlight some of the legislation that we've seen also streamline these efforts. But again, similar to Alaska, we're looking at what worked during COVID that might be permanent. But as Dustin highlighted, we've had this culture or approach since Governor Hickenlooper's administration. So for more than 10 years, we've really undertaken a regulatory review process where we're doing rule reviews every 3 to 5 years across all state agencies, really looking at necessity and cost. And then also holding regular roundtables and stakeholder engagement to make sure that we're eliminating unnecessary rules. So that is also now dictated by statute to have those annual reviews, and also we develop each year a regulatory agenda of what rules we think we are going to look at and what we think the outcome of those will become. And so we submit that to the General Assembly. As we review those rules, we really look at whether the rule is necessary, if it's duplicative, if it's written in plain language, so it's easy to understand, if it's achieving the desired intent, or whether we can eliminate burden and give more flexibility. And then we also have a process in Colorado where a cost benefit analysis can be performed. And that's really an opportunity for stakeholders to request the reason for the rule and the economic benefit or burden. So that is one process that is also through the Department of Regulatory Agencies in a different division, but every state agency is subject to that process. So again, we really just do focus on the lean efforts. We've been part of the national consortium to make sure we're streamlining. And that's where I would highlight these three bills. We had the VOCAL program. It's a Veterans Occupational Credentialing program where we systematically reviewed every profession to try to find ways to get our veterans credentialed without having them have to start over. So really a great impact with as much as $50,000 in savings each year. House Bill 1326, the Occupational Credentialing Portability Program, really focused on portability from other states and reducing timelines and barriers for any applicant coming into Colorado. It also provided a 3-year free license for any military spouse that was licensed in good standing in another state. So that was a really incredible bill. And then the last bill, just quickly I'll highlight, was 19-1290, which streamlined how barber cosmetologists who might be trained in a foreign jurisdiction could get licensed more easily. So next slide. So what the future holds, I think you might have to, yep. So we continue to focus, similar to other states, on interstate compacts, making sure that we're able to streamline and provide access. One more. We definitely leverage the centralization of our efforts, and we've even centralized our rulemaking and our rule review and stakeholder engagement internally to make sure that we're efficient in promulgating rules and in reviewing rules. And as we've mentioned, we definitely have leveraged technology. We are facing many of the same issues Alaska and other states are facing around telehealth, rural access, how we might demonstrate competency and licensing. And again, we just think it's so important as we look at what the future holds in regulation and for what we need for workforce, that we continue to engage with all populations, especially vulnerable populations, and make sure that we make it as least burdensome as possible. And next slide. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I appreciate the time.
Did Ronnie, let me just ask, did you have another slide or two that we didn't end up showing?
I think it was just I'm happy to answer questions, so that's fine.
Great. Well, thank you to our speakers in this session. That was very informative. I'd like to invite, we have a few minutes for questions and a discussion, and I'd like to invite the previous speakers from our first session to join in since they do have audio, and happy to hear from you all in terms of questions for our panel just now. We do
Thanks,
also.
Sally. This is Liz Tanner. I had a question about the cost benefit analysis. And I'd be curious to know if other states require a cost benefit analysis from their state agencies for each of their items, and if there are any states that require that of legislative bills for that are coming across their desk. So, because I know that we've run into some problems with it from a building code perspective. But gosh, I sure wish that sometimes the legislature would have a cost benefit analysis with theirs as well. So I'm just curious to know if other states have it. But so thanks for the opportunity to ask.
Sure.
Probably chime in on that.
Great. Go ahead.
So I would say the majority of states have some kind of requirement for economic analysis for regulations, but it's often pretty rudimentary. So it's not nearly as sophisticated as the kind of analysis you'd see from the federal government that could be hundreds of pages long, sometimes for some of these major regulations. The states that stand out in terms of cost benefit analysis are states like Colorado and Rhode Island, I would say, and that they have, like in Rhode Island, they have this Office of Regulatory Reform that plays a role much like OMB at the federal level, where they review regulations and they really have kind of a focus on the economics as part of their review. And so that tends to help strengthen the regulatory analysis. A couple states that stand out are also Virginia, or West Virginia actually, recently created a legislative office that does regulatory analysis. And that's kind of unique in the sense that it's independent of the agency that's regulating. So it's kind of like a CBO-like office. It's called the Division of Fiscal and Regulatory Affairs. There's also this Washington state has something called the Washington Institute for Public Policy, which is kind of quasi-governmental, quasi-academic body that reviews government programs and does cost benefit analysis on kind of a case-by-case basis. There's not much in the way of legislative cost benefit analysis, probably primarily because it's legislation can be so much more complicated than regulations. But there is fiscal node analysis that's done in most states where they look at least at the budgetary impacts, like how much taxes or spending might change as a result of legislation. So I would say look at states like Rhode Island, Colorado, West Virginia. Virginia is also a state where the budget office does the economic analysis, and it's independent of the agencies that manage the programs.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for the question, Liz. And I would just offer you an opportunity. Do you have anything from Rhode Island's perspective that's a particular challenge, or any examples that you wanted to share?
Well, just first, we oversee the building code commissioner's office, and the building code is based on a national standard. And so we're now in a situation where every time you change the building code, which is about every other year, you have to do a cost benefit analysis, and it's quite burdensome because it's based on a federal code. And so there's really not much you're changing. And so while we've figured out how to make it work, I can see where it could be very expensive and it could be very burdensome. I don't think many other areas have the problem that we do with it, but when you're basing it off of a federal statute or a national code, it's a little more challenging.
And sort of related to that, we have a question in the QA box about strategies that work for states in terms of construction plan review and inspection, whether that can be delayed significantly due to travel, lack of qualified inspectors, and non-competitive government salaries. Where can we find examples? Good question. Thank you, Linda from New Mexico, I believe. Looking for examples that improve customer service and doesn't reduce customer safety at the same time.
Sally, I'm happy to take a shot at it if you'd like me to. This is Liz Tanner.
Yes, Liz, thank you.
So for us, we're suffering the same problems. Part of our problem was that about 10 years ago, they increased the requirements for an inspector, and it's then resulted in a huge shortage of building inspectors and building officials in that space. Very often because these are hands-on folks and they're not necessarily great test takers. So we are hoping to pass legislation this year that takes away that testing requirement and instead relies on years of service to the industry. Another thing that we've done to make it easier is we had started to make a conversion pre-COVID to iPads and being able to do things electronically on the spot. But we're hoping to take it actually to a next step further. And we're actually going to be purchasing a tickets system, so somewhat like a parking meter, so that we can hand out tickets and inspection reports on site. And so that's something that we're looking at purchasing right now in order to save the time of going back to the office, typing the reports, sending it in, violations, whatever they may be. So those are some tools that we have tried, but we are suffering the same problem. It's been very difficult, and a big part of it is the low salaries. We actually have 9 municipalities that are sharing multiple building officials and inspectors across the state. So it's a real big problem for us as well.
Thank you for going into such rich detail and examples for us. Did any of our speakers from this session that we just heard have any additional examples or thoughts they want to throw out given this discussion?
This is Ronnie. I would just echo what Liz just said. So we have healthcare and non-healthcare. So we have electrical and plumbing boards, and we definitely are seeing the same shortage of electrical, particularly electrical inspectors. And we have shifted a little bit. Instead of having them be assigned to a particular area, we've shifted to have some roaming inspectors, which is a little bit challenging given the size of the state and the rural areas. But it's also why we adopted, where we could in residential projects, the remote video inspection. So that's taken a lot of testing. And then similarly, we sort of made do with some of the technology we had. So we had some extra iPads, and we were able to develop our forms and insert on inspections the information so that we could get it into the system faster. So but it's the same thing with salaries and just the workforce we need and getting them to pass the exams.
Thank you, Ronnie. And Sarah, did you have any examples you were going to throw out? I am just now seeing we're 4 minutes away from ending, and I did want to provide some follow-up information to this event. So unless we have any burning questions coming in here at the very last minute, let me switch over to Sophia Yeager from our team, who's going to provide on one sheet all the contact information that you need from our wonderful speakers today. Thank you so much to all of you. And Sophia, if you are there, she'll also let us know about forthcoming publications. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. And again, to echo Sally, thank you so much to all of our presenters. This was so informative, and I hope that our state folks in attendance today came away with some strategies that they can implement across the country. So on the next slide, you'll see, as Sally said, we've compiled all the contact information for the speakers that you've heard today, as well as folks from the Pew team and the NGA team. So please feel free to reach out to any of our guest speakers, as well as anybody from the Pew or NGA teams if you have as Sally also said, we have some supplemental resources on the next slide, including the 2 papers that we've previewed with you all today, the paper on the one-stops and the paper on streamlining regulatory efforts. So those are forthcoming from NGA in the next month or so. We also have a link to a previous paper that NGA and Pew put out as part of this project related in the context of economic recovery. Oh.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're cutting out a little bit for me. I don't know if that's happening for everybody.
If you can't hear me, then perhaps, Sally, you should finish up.
Well, the last item that we have on our last sheet here for the slides is that we have a list of state and territory business portals. If anyone is interested in accessing a broader range of what states are doing in that area, we'll be happy to share that. And we are, I think somebody mentioned in the next several months, these papers will be coming out. The evolving state one-stops offer new ways to help businesses and learning from state regulatory streamlining efforts. However, I would say that I believe they're coming out literally in just a few weeks. So we're looking forward to that, and we'll definitely be announcing and releasing those with a flourish. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. This has been a really informative, helpful event, and we want to double thank our wonderful speakers and authors, and And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day today. Thanks again to everybody.